Let's talk about these excess deaths. You might have heard some of these stories, probably not in your mainstream media, about what the government is hiding as it relates to excess deaths. We'll get there in a second, but the American CDC and the British healthcare agencies over the past few days have quietly updated their websites over the weekend, hoping perhaps that you wouldn't even notice these major changes. Here's Alex Berenson. By the way, you'll remember that the White House wanted to have Alex Berenson deplatformed, right, for telling the truth. Here he tweets this: "Hey kids, see if you can figure out what the CDC.gov website changed in its discussion of the mRNA shots. Turns out mRNA is the gift that keeps on giving." And then he tweeted this. Take a look at this. This is the CDC changing into its website.
All right. So the one on the left is what used to be there, right? So what are the main points? Okay. That mRNA cannot give someone COVID, that they do not interact with your DNA. Those things remain for the one on the right. This piece at the bottom, the third piece, the mRNA and the spike protein do not last long in the body. That's what we were told, right, when we expressed concerns about receiving said vaccinations.
So they took off the lower left-hand part of your screen. They've now removed the part that says the spike protein does not last long in the body. That has now been removed from their website.
So it's debatable whether they ever had the right to say that, because the COVID vaccine was the first approved or mRNA vaccine that was ever put into use, right? No other vaccine using this technology was ever put into circulation in the population for various reasons, right? So did they ever have a leg to stand on to tell us this in the first place,
well,
right?
How would they, right? They didn't have enough years of trials. They didn't have enough. We heard from a number of doctors who said we need at least 2 years, if not more than that, to have any discernible data that we can say, yes, these are safe. These are.
Well, that's talking specifically about whether or not it's safe. I'm talking about the piece of it that's mRNA, right? And so that piece of technology was only ever first used in the COVID vaccines.
Right, but we wouldn't know if it lasts long in the body because we didn't have enough time to figure out how long it's there.
Right, yes.
Go ahead, David.
That's what Robert Malone, though. Robert Malone is the guy who invented the delivery method for that, and he was saying all along that it was a bad idea to do what was going on, and they removed him from Wikipedia, like they silenced him, so yes. he was sounding the horn right away.
He was as you pointed out, he was the inventor of the technology in the delivery mechanism for mRNA.
Yes.
They moved quickly to discredit him. Like his Wikipedia page was changed to David's point, and they removed his history. Like, it's like, okay, you're Thomas Edison, you create the light bulb, right? And then someone just goes and then takes that off your Wikipedia page. Now you're just Thomas Edison, some guy who likes light.
Well, and he was also labeled an anti-vaxxer when he's like the guy that he was trying to work on a delivery method to make vaccines better. So he's like way pro-vax.
Right. Yes.
And then the British side of this, so that's the American CDC side, the mRNA side. And then here's a tweet from Tracy like this, British. She says, "Ooh, would you look at this? The UK government quietly removes approval for use of COVID vax in pregnant and breastfeeding women 2 years after injecting them with it. Admits safety cannot be assured at this current time." From the UK government. You want to go through this one?
I mean, no, I do not, because I can't talk about it in a different octave than this one.
That's a pretty high octave.
I can't.
I want to talk about it up here.
No, you talk about it, because I'm going to get
It's going to make me mad.
Worked up.
It's going to get me. You want to go up
We
here?
don't talk about COVID.
Oh, now?
Now we can talk.
Now you can. Okay.
So, no, you
now
were safe.
You cannot be assured at this current time, when the data showed that you never could have been sure. I'm sorry, I can't.
All right, just don't hit the table.
No, that was awesome, because when you did that, it shook all of our cameras. So
Sorry.
It like added effect.
Yeah, even David's camera, and he's
like I'm
3,000 miles away
right now. Like, the data always showed that it was not, that there was no way to secure, what's the word they're using? Cannot be assured of safety. The original data showed that they could not assure safety for pregnant women. So now all of a sudden they're saying they knew it. They never could say that this was 100% safe, especially for pregnant mummies.
So here is the toxicity conclusions. Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I wonder if this information would be coming to light if Pfizer was able to hide those documents for 75 years. Like, I wonder if we would be at this point in the conversation without that.
It's hard to say. Those were the documents we started to learn. I mean, among the revelations we got, right, were the lack of trials,
Right.
the lack of, I mean, we were also
But
seeing.
I think that if I remember correctly, the numbers on the first round of the doses given in December of 2021 were at least between 20 and 30 spontaneous abortions. Spontaneous, yeah, right? Like it caused a woman to miscarry.
In addition to which, we saw myocarditis. We saw all of these adverse effects that were hidden inside of these data points. And yeah, it's a great point. I mean, maybe, and of course, then Pfizer was forced then to start releasing these documents. Instead of 75 years, the judge said, no, you've got to get them out within the next 8 months.
Yes.
And they started releasing documents every Friday, thousands upon thousands of documents every Friday.
Now, going over those documents earned us a strike on YouTube. We got punished for it. That is a form of censorship, right? For you were not supposed to. And all we did was read their own published data, right? And we had to go off the air for two weeks.
Yeah.
And again, what we were looking at was whether or not they knew that there were adverse effects, and there were all kinds. It was a laundry list, right? But specifically, a pregnant woman losing her pregnancy means that you could never assure a pregnant woman that this was 100% safe bet for the baby, for you and the baby.
And W4 in our chat says, remember, Senator Ron Johnson held a conference with close to 100 different doctors and scientists who had all suffered and been silenced. He had them all together for a 6-hour discussion back in 2021. And of course, if I'm not mistaken, that first conference that you're referring to was removed from social media.
Yes.
It was taken off of YouTube. You were not allowed to see it. It was only his secondary conference that that you could see, that you could actually watch.
Yeah, and he invited Fauci. He invited the CEOs of the drug companies. Like, he invited all the people that should have been there to be part of this conversation.
Yeah. Phil Marston says, Pfizer vaccine made me feel like I was dying, in our chat. So let's go through the toxicity conclusions. This is from the British side of things here. We'll just kind of skip through this. But this is what they're saying 2 years after injecting women with these.
This is from gov.uk. Okay,
Yeah.
official source.
This is official source from the government of the UK's website. The absence of reproductive toxicity data is a reflection of the speed of development to first identify and select COVID-19 mRNA vaccine for clinical testing and its rapid development to meet the ongoing urgent health need. In principle, a decision on licensing a vaccine could be taken in these circumstances without data from the reproductive toxicity studies animals. But there are studies ongoing, and these will be provided when available. In the context of supply, it's considered that sufficient reassurance of safe use of the vaccine in pregnant women cannot be provided at the present time.
Oh, no.
However, use in women of childbearing potential could be supported, provided healthcare professionals are advised to rule out known or suspected pregnancy prior to vaccination. Women who are breastfeeding should also not be vaccinated.
What?
These judgments reflect the absence of data.
I'm not breastfeeding.
That means if you're breastfeeding and you got it or didn't get it because you're like the news anchor from ESPN that got let go because she didn't want to do it because she was having a baby. Now think about that. If you were breastfeeding, you didn't do it, you'd lose your job. You could lose your income. There are actually people in like nurses or teachers that are getting lower salaries in Australia now that aren't getting or didn't want to take the vax.
Yeah.
Unbelievable. So now the UK government's saying, hey, we don't feel safe with that. So unless there's some reason that a healthcare provider can tell you that you should get it, you probably shouldn't. You probably shouldn't, because we just don't think that these things are safe. What? Now, here's the real question I have, right? In all of this bullshit is, when did you know this? How were you covering this up? And what were you keeping from the world population in these different governments? Right.
Well, we know that Pfizer knew this as early as January 2022. No, December. No, I misspoke earlier, because the Pfizer documents that we went over started December 2020, not December 2021.
Right.
And they knew then that there were adverse effects specifically for pregnancies. And so you would think the government would have seen those things, read those things before that. Yes, we know for a fact they did, right? And they still...
That's why
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that's why the bigger question for me isn't like when and what did they know? It's why. why would you do that if you knew that?
Yeah.
Like how was that coordinated worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you follow the money, and again, this is where you have doctors like Dr. Campbell and Peter McCullough and others. They're reluctant to come out and just say flat out, follow the money, but they always kind of leave it hanging there. Like when you look at the biopharmaceutical complex, which is just like the military-industrial complex, and you think about you think about BlackRock and Vanguard and these big companies that own multiple pieces of these biopharmaceutical complex, right? The companies that own everything. And the billions and billions of dollars that they make off of these things. Of course, there's a lot of money at stake. I mean, just read any of your favorite thriller novels, right? If there's money involved in it, there's always a cover-up. That's always the heart of it. And the reason it works, it's because it's true. Time and time again, we've seen this.
Dr. Pierre Corey, he's not afraid to hide it. Like the last conference that, or get together that Ron Johnson had, Pierre Corey went off on that fact, like talking about following the money, and got into a little bit of detail about it, like certain things they were doing to ensure that there were a lot of COVID diagnosis.
Yeah.
So now let's get to the excess deaths part of this story.
Okay. So Scotland has started to investigate why there are so many excess deaths that are not related to COVID. Now, what they define as excess deaths is they have an algorithm for how many people die at any given time of the year. And they take into effects like, during the holidays, more people die of traffic incidents, for instance. During flu season, more people die. That there's kind of a normal ebb and flow of population death,
There's
right?
more traffic accidents on New Year's Day or because of people drinking and driving.
That kind of thing.
Right.
So if you look at this chart, right, you see that in Scotland, there has been an excess of over 1,800 excess deaths. Now, earlier this year, the government of Scotland, the Parliament, decided to launch an inquiry, right, or an investigation. They said the COVID-19 Recovery Committee is undertaking an inquiry into the cause of excess deaths in Scotland since the start of the pandemic. Data shows that deaths in Scotland are 11% above average for this time of year and have been for the last 26 weeks. And it is unclear why this is happening. So for the last 26 weeks, excess deaths, that means they're not caused by COVID and they're not a normal amount. People are dying. So the committee sought guidance on the following questions. One, has there been a public health emergency that shifted COVID deaths to non-COVID deaths? Right? Is there a new emergency? I think we're going to be able to argue yes. Is there evidence that patients are now presenting in a more acute condition? What accounts for the deaths of non-COVID conditions? Is there enough of a strategic focus on the indirect impacts of the pandemic? I think this is the question, right? Is there enough of a strategic focus on the indirect health impacts of the pandemic? So we shut everything down. We kept people indoors. Does it turn out that caused more deaths?
So for instance, let's just unpack that a little bit. So, okay, because we closed everything down and people didn't go to the hospitals and get screened for a mammogram or get their mammogram,
yes,
right? Did they end up dying of breast cancer?
Well, we can narrow it down by population, and this is what's interesting. So if you look at this graph of excess deaths, I'm sorry if it's a little small on the screen that you're watching, but it starts April 2020, the start of the pandemic, and it goes all the way through April 2022. The bottom line is COVID deaths, right? The top line that's gray is what is expected, and the line above that, that's blue, is excess non-COVID related deaths. So even, what's interesting is if you look at the first bit of data, is that while there were a ton of COVID deaths, there were a ton of unrelated excess deaths at the same time, right? So shutting down had an immediate negative effect on the population. And then it sort of tracks, right, with what is expected for excess deaths.
So from July until like October, it kind of tracks, yeah.
And then it continues to track, but this is for the entire population. Let's look at the next one. This is excess deaths for all persons. So again, this is sort of a different graphical representation. This is exactly what we think. And yellow is COVID, right? But then we're going to sort by population. The next bit shows us excess deaths for people 0 to 24. These are young people. Why are young people dying in excess from, let's say, July 2021 on through this month? Why is this happening?
And we've covered this in our newsletter. We have a daily newsletter. You should all subscribe at redacted.inc. And one of the things we covered in the newsletter is a number of, not just Australia, the UK, and the United States, undertakers and those that run funeral homes talking about an inordinate amount of coffins being ordered for young people.
Right. And so what they're saying, again, is this is not COVID related, although there is nothing in this data that would indicate any adverse reaction to the vaccine, nor do I trust that they even would give it to us, right? And so there was a big hullabaloo about a big athlete, an elite athlete who died last week, just sort of all of a sudden. And they're saying, well, is this related to vaccination? None of this data indicates that at all, but I just don't know if we would see that. So what is the trajectory then of these excess deaths? Will they stop or will they keep going? We're going to throw to Dr. John Campbell for his opinion on this as he goes through this data.
For the past 14 of the past 15 weeks, there's been around 1,000 deaths, extra deaths each week, none of which are due to COVID, more than we would expect. So this has been going on for some months. Well, for of the past 15 weeks, the death rate has been higher than we would expect for 14 of those weeks. Around 1,000 extra deaths each week. And if this current trajectory continues, this analysis indicates, the number of non-COVID excess deaths will soon outstrip COVID deaths this year for the year 2020. I find that quite alarming, really. Deaths have been attributed by the government to circulatory diseases, diabetes and cancers. But of course, that doesn't tell us what's the precipitating factors for these.
So what he's saying is, why circulatory and diabetes? Why more cancer, right? Is it because of all of these lifestyle factors that came about during lockdowns where all there was to do was eat? I know this from personal experience.
And drink.
All there was to do was drink.
Smoke.
And procreate.
We didn't do any of that, thankfully. We couldn't even, like, police turned Clayton around for walking our dog, right? You couldn't go get fresh air. You could not socialize. So are these things, is it that or is it something more? Now, he says soon in the UK, there will be more non-COVID related excess deaths than COVID related excess deaths. But if you look at the chart that I just showed you, can we go back to number 2, England 2? For young people, that's already happening. Already there are more excess deaths that are not COVID related than...
Right. It'd be interesting, if these were older, individuals, and you say, okay, these are older people, maybe there's something else going on here. But the fact that these are younger people who are, and we actually saw a big study out this afternoon too about now we're seeing conclusively individuals under 40 years old with adverse effects from myocarditis. So,
that could be one population, or another theory that I had today is, COVID it attacked the most vulnerable population, but did the lifestyle that we were forced to adopt during COVID create a new vulnerable population, right? And so now we have more people who have pre-existing conditions than before, either because they weren't having regular health care, or the stress of being inside with an abusive spouse, or the stress of losing your job, or the stress of being a teacher for your kids when you're not trained as a teacher, all of those types of things, right? Now, this brought to mind something that I remember early in the pandemic that President Trump had said, because he had sort of heard it trumpeted on Fox News a lot, saying, we cannot let the cure for COVID be worse than the problem itself. And I remember at the time thinking, oh, you just want this to be over because it's election season, right? But this is exactly what they were worried about, is that there would be more negative reactions to the way we were handling it than actually deaths from COVID, and we could get there in short order. Will we put flags on the White House lawn for all the excess deaths caused by the pandemic?
No.
No. Will we, get any kind of mea culpa from the government who made these decisions unilaterally when there was data to support not doing that? No, right? And so this is indicative that there will be lasting damage from the pandemic. That's not just PTSD from being in lockdown with your family. So once again, I remind you that Dr. Fauci does not think that that's the case. He thinks that there was no irreparable damage.
Well, and what really ticks me...
I don't think it's forever irreparably damaged anyone.
No.
Right. And then I heard from, I think it was a governor of Minnesota, I think out today, also a Democrat, saying that, no, these, lockdowns were fine. They were fine. They didn't hurt anyone. Like, are you out of your mind when the data is overwhelming that it hurt individuals? In fact, there was a story out today. Lord Sumption wrote a piece for the Sunday Times of UK about the lockdown policy that could be called, he said, "I told you so." Here's a little just excerpt. He said, "It was always obvious that you could not close down a country for months on end without serious consequences. The shocking thing that emerges from the interviews is the government refused to take them into account. There was no assessment of the likely collateral costs of the lockdown."
Well, there was, but we called those people crazy, right? Mm-hmm. I was one of them, sure. I thought, stop it. We all have to, don't be selfish. Nobody wanted to listen to that data because we were all scared out of our minds.
I remember Kid Rock in an interview with Tucker Carlson saying that. He's like, yeah, we all did that. He's like, I wash my hands 80 times a day. I was like, okay, we're going to do lockdowns. This is all, I saw some in the chat, 2 weeks to flatten the curve. This way, they were lying to us.
Yeah.
Buying a bunch
and
of toilet paper.
They were scaring us in order to get us to agree to these things. And, we didn't know. We're like, oh, okay, I guess we have to keep our kids home. Then.
So my question, my question comes back to the beginning, right? Which is, what did you know? When did you know it? And what were you hiding from us? When was the data available to you in the White House? When was the data available to you at the CDC? When was the data available to you at in the medical staff, that were driving these decisions at the World Health Organization, right? When did you know this? And why did you keep it a secret? And now only through court orders are we learning this shit.
Well, again, I point to the fact that, and I hate to say this, right, because at the time I didn't want to hear this from President Trump, but at the time President Trump was against the lockdowns and they really shut him down. And, I fell in line with the mainstream media, don't say that, you just don't want to deal with this, right?
Right.
But did he have economists and demographers who had this data? Surely this has been available for longer than before the pandemic.
Yeah, I want to point to people in the chat are saying, yeah, Lord Sumption is a great truth teller. By the way, if you're just curious with that article, I'll put it up on the screen again. It was from the Sunday Times, the UK, and basically the truth about lockdown and becoming impossible to deny. It was a disaster, he writes. So if you want to go check out that piece.
We're going to talk more about that as we get to the piece about corporal punishment in schools.
Yeah.
Because that's how we really owe our children one. So let's hit them.
I mean, there's also a whole new movement for lockdowns coming out. I mean, we're going to talk about this, I think, later this week on the show about more lockdowns, but this time not around COVID. You're going to hear there's plans in place at the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum level to move towards lockdowns for climate purposes. So we're going to show you some of the videos that have been emerging from these globalists who want us to do that now as it relates to climate. David, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say there was a moment where, one of it was somebody in Chicago. I can't remember. It wasn't the mayor, but somebody might have been the governor. But they said it wasn't about, what was going on. It was about compliance, like getting people to comply. And the problem I have is that they're still pushing all of this on kids. And it's like they're not looking at the long-term effects, or they're at least not admitting the long-term effects that this is going to have on children. And that's where I get really frustrated. Like, I was willing to, as an adult, I can make my own decision and all that. But as a child, they depend on us to make decisions for them. And if we're being forced to make those decisions for them, then that's where that's when I really got pissed off, is when they lowered that age.
Yeah.
And then you saw like last week that 4-year-old. There was a 4-year-old that they called the cops in Los Angeles because this 4-year-old wasn't wearing a mask to school. So like masking, lockdowns, the disastrous effects not only on children but businesses and entire communities, in total denial about it. Again, when did they know this was going to be a problem? Many of them, we could argue, knew this beforehand, that it would have been an absolute disaster. But again, we're going to go through this again as we enter into the movements on climate.